the biggest climate change bill that's ever been passed in the history of the United States just passed the Senate today and is going to be signed by President Biden very soon. This is gigantic legislation. Let's go through it. So first off, just to put in perspective on how big this bill is, this act, the Inflation Reduction Act, is 4,933% of the annual Department of Energy budget. This is way bigger than anything that has ever been passed, with the $370 billion from this act, plus the $148 billion that's from the infrastructure bill. We're investing heavily into solutions for climate change and the technology that's needed in the 21st century. In the infrastructure bill alone, we have $65 billion going for clean energy and grid investments, $7.5 billion to a national network of charging stations for electronic vehicles, $55 billion to expand access to clean drinking water, $21 billion to clean up Superfund and brown sites. This is huge funding compared to the normal $7.5 billion that the DOE normally gets every year. We have to spend these massive amounts of money in order to make the investments and the infrastructure needed in order to transition away from fossil fuels. The number one thing people ask me as a scientist going on to panels and interviews is, why aren't we actually investing in doing anything about climate change? And the fact is that we are. We have tons of new technologies and research that's happening at the academic and small scale level, but we need these massive billion-dollar level investments in order to scale the technologies up so that they can actually be used at a national level. So what is in the biggest climate change bill that's ever passed in the history of the United States? This is a Senate Democrats' summary of the bill, and this is going to be very likely almost the exact legislation that is finally passed in the House and that is eventually signed by Biden. Overall, we're talking about a 40% emissions reduction by 2030. So looking at the nuts and bolts now of where this $370 billion is going, we have the first one is the lowering consumer energy costs, $9 billion in order to make electrify home appliances to make it more affordable. So you have rebate programs that you would apply and get money back for purchasing these new appliances. You have 10 years of consumer tax credits for clean energy. So these are programs that you can apply to and get tax credits for actually installing these rooftop solars, these electric HVACs, and other water heaters solutions. Also, we have a new $4,000 consumer tax credit for lower and middle income people in order to buy used clean vehicles. And the electric vehicles are going to need to run for a rather long time in order to actually keep up with their carbon footprint in order to create them. So this is a really good idea in order to keep people buying and using these electric vehicles that are a little bit older. And along with the $7,500 new clean vehicle tax credit. You also have a $1 billion grant to make affordable housing more efficient. So a grant is going to be a fund of money that places that if you own, like, let's say an affordable housing complex, you can actually apply for that money and get that money back in order to make your house or your home or your apartment buildings more energy efficient. So next up, we have American manufacturing of these renewable products. So where are they being made? A lot of times they're being made in places like China, and which are places that don't have the most strict environmental regulations, and then they're being flown over and sold in the United States, and that costs even more energy. So with programs like this $60 billion invested in here, now we can actually afford to make these manufacturing facilities in the United States and sold in the United States. So this is what we're talking about here. The solar panels. Solar panels are wind turbines, batteries. These are all things and technologies that we're going to need to make going forward. This is what renewable fuels and sustainable fuels are, because these things can be reused and invested into and have decades and decades of performance related to it. And second bullet point, $10 billion to clean technology manufacturing facilities. So these are those harder to make things, those unique, specific turbines and manufacturing goods that aren't easy to make. $2 billion for grants to retool existing auto manufacturing. So this is probably the tools and robots necessary in order to actually install batteries and motors and things like that aren't actually used in the United States currently. Up to $20 billion in new clean vehicle manufacturing facilities, and $2 billion for national labs to accelerate breakthrough energy research. So this is things like the Department of Energy, where they are trying to manufacture and build the latest and the newest battery technology. All right, number 3, we have Decarbonize the Economy. These are tax credits and grants that are going to be for creating an economy and the infrastructure that's costs less and creates less of a carbon footprint. So right now we have a lot of old commercial vehicles and transportation focused manufacturing that we can transition over to clean and renewable energy. And these are, for example, cement, $27 billion for Clean Energy Technology Accelerator to reduce emissions, and a methane reduction program to reduce the amount of leaks. So a lot of stuff that we're not even taking care of right now, and a lot of methane that we can be trapping that has a huge impact, a lot more than CO2 per molecule. Methane has a much bigger impact on greenhouse gases. So this is absolutely huge. Number 4, we have invest in communities and environmental justice, $60 billion to drive investments into disadvantaged communities. These are a lot of places that are economically disadvantaged, so that they have higher rates of pollution. And as we know, pollution, bad environmental health from pollution equals bad public health and human health. So these are programs to try to help clean up those pollution. So these communities have a huge problem with infrastructure that isn't reliable or sustainable or renewable. So ports, interestingly enough, is that they are a very huge source of emissions, because a lot of times the truckers or the semis will be sitting there at idle in traffic and going in and out. It takes a very long time, and they're sitting in traffic. So one of the new ways of people trying to think about ports is, how can we reduce the amount of traffic? And this would be to help create in the installation of zero emission equipment and technology to try to reduce the amount of just stalling that happens there. In addition, we have clean energy, clean heavy-duty vehicles like transit buses and garbage trucks. $1 billion for that. Lastly, number 5, farmers and rural community investments. This is $20 billion to support climate-smart agricultural practices. This has a huge impact on emissions. So these are, cow farms, for example, will have a lot of emissions that are related to them. And farms just in general, they actually have a lot of CO2 emissions that are associated with it, methane from the cows, but then also a lot of runoff. So $20 billion to reduce the amount of runoff has a big impact, because a lot of the plant nutrients that they have runs off into waterways and rivers, and then that leads out into places that meet with the ocean, and the ocean then will have these huge blooms and of algae, creating an oxygen minimal zone. Basically, off of the coast of every single city in the world are oxygen minimal zones where there are pockets of the ocean, believe it or not, that don't have any oxygen in them, so that when the schools of fish swim through them, they all die. And these are the stories where you hear about, like, oh, why did 3,000, like a school of 3,000 fish just wind up dead on the beach? Like, well, they ran into an oxygen minimal zone that was from runoff from a farm. So this is a huge impact. $5 billion for fire resilient forests, forest conservation, urban tree planting. These are huge investments that are needed because as humans, we are living in a stationary space that normally probably has fires going through it. It's very natural, actually, for the environment to have fires that takes out a lot of the old foliage, the old plants. It returns that carbon and nitrogen and phosphorus into the atmosphere and the environment. But we live in homes and we don't want our homes burned down. So how are we going to deal with that? Next, we have the tax credits and grants to support the domestic production of biofuels, which would be algae biofuels, in order to build infrastructure for the sustainable aviation fuel that is needed. This is because engines in a plane just can't be electronic. There can't be motors. They just don't have the thrust necessary in order to actually sustain like a 747 in flight. It doesn't make any sense. So we have to have combustion engines going forward. So we have to have a renewable source for that fuel. And this is an investment into that. $2.6 billion in grants to conserve and restore coastal habitats and protect communities. This is a huge one for me. This is a huge problem that we're having right now, where wetlands are going extinct across the globe because, believe it or not, 90% of wetlands that have gone extinct in the last 50 years, and it's due to human activity. Humans want to live there. We want to build parking lots and homes and buildings on these coasts, and guess what was there before? Wetlands. So wetlands are homes for estuaries for birds, they're for fish, they have amphibians, a huge impact on the environment. And removing an entire ecosystem is going to have cascading impacts on everything. So we need to conserve wetlands, and we also need to rehabilitate them and rehabilitate the animal populations that are associated with them. I feel like the only good faith critique that is worth considering and talking about, since the Republicans are against any type of climate change bill because they don't believe that it is actually real, I feel like the only good critique is actually from the left. So this is a piece from Nathan Robinson in Current Affairs called "Can a Boon for the Fossil Fuel Sector Really Be Called a Climate Bill?" And in it, he has a quote from Jacobin that says, quote, "Under the bill, the Interior Department would be required to offer up at least 2 million acres of federal land and 60 million acres of offshore acreage to oil and gas producers every year for the next decade. If they fall short, they wouldn't be able to announce some permitting aspects of the wind and solar projects on federal land. It would be the first ever required minimum acreage for offshore oil and gas leasing and significantly increase the acreage requirements for onshore leasing." Sounds bad, right? It sounds bad. I looked at the actual amount of land that we have in federal land that we are actually using for drilling right now. So right now, we are using 166 million acres in the United States for oil and gas production. The 2 million acres per year over 10 years would equate to 20 million acres. This 20 million acres is a 12% increase in the federal land used for oil and gas. Again, I looked into Bureau of Land Management for the second claim. So right now, for offshore oil drilling, we use 2.3 billion acres. And this bill would increase the amount of acres over 10 years by 600. It seems like a lot. 600 million acres. That is a lot of land. It's a lot of offshore oil space. But this is an increase of 26% over 10 years. What I still look at, though, what I can't get around is that this is a 4,933% increase over the Department of Energy budget that we normally spend for climate change anyway. This is a huge increase. Do I like that 12% more federal land is going to oil? No. That's awful. Is 26% increase in the amount of offshore oil drilling space? Is that a good thing? No, I don't think that is a good thing. But if we're talking about 4,933% just in this bill alone, by the way, just this act, just the Inflation Reduction Act, if you include the $148 billion from the infrastructure bill, it's even a higher percentage compared to the DOE budget on climate change. I mean, we're talking about the biggest investment in climate change that the United States has ever had versus a 12% increase of oil drilling on federal lands. So I think that there are gigantic positives that, by the way, that could have cascading positive impacts in this from this legislation. This technology and these energy investments could spur more technologies, new energy solutions that could completely change the outcome for us as a species and for the United States in order to actually produce these new technologies in the future and actually be a huge source for these new renewable and sustainable technologies in the future. I think that the benefits far, far, far outweigh the negatives on this one. Absolutely, no question. Next, Nathan Robinson talks about how this Inflation Reduction Act is not going to get us to the U.S. Paris Agreement that we should have gone. I agree. I don't think that we are on the track that we need to be, but we need huge investments in these technologies so that we can scale up from these small research or pilot scale productions to the national scales. And that's what these big bills do. That's what this does. It doesn't get us to where we need to be. I agree. But right now, the difference and why we can't, when people ask me, why are we doing this? It's because, well, we haven't invested into these new cleaner, sustainable, renewable technologies. But now through this bill, hopefully we have. Hopefully we can. Hopefully we can get some tangible things through and the ball rolling on these issues. Nathan Robinson continues, streamlining permitting for natural gas pipelines and export is not climate action, it is the opposite. This is so-called deal forced by Senator Manchin and what we would expect when friends and beneficiaries of the fossil fuel industry have effective control over climate policy. We should not accept deals that strengthen the oil and gas industry to the detriment of us all. We could easily, with more senators that believe that climate change is a problem, could enact new legislation that would stop these offshore drilling and the federal land use for oil and gas pipelines. We could stop that while also keeping the investment in energy and research technologies. We can do both. What Nathan Robinson is talking about here is a call for more people getting in the Senate that believes in climate change, not throwing away this bill. Nathan Robinson concludes, regardless of how much one celebrates the bill, one fact is clear. It is not on its own a sufficient solution to the climate crisis. It is at best a start and requires unsavory compromises that threaten to make the problems worse. A start? We already have been starting. People like me, scientists and engineers in this space, have already been starting. This is what pisses me off the most, by the way, is that people like this absolutely piss on climate scientists, engineers, all these people that have dedicated their lives to science, and they throw all of our accomplishments into the trash and piss on them just so that they can score political points because Biden's bill doesn't go far enough. If we are serious about the problem, we must begin with the fact that the problem comes from fossil fuel use. humans are the cause, or the problem comes from humans. The problem comes from humans. A bill that threatens fossil fuels as part of the comprehensive set of solutions to climate is like a bill to improve healthcare that also contains funding for releasing new viruses. It's an absurdity. Look, I think we don't have time to wait. I'm so sick of all these people, like Nathan Robinson and everyone on Twitter downplaying this stuff. They're supposedly taking it so seriously, and yet they can't recognize the biggest climate change bill and infrastructure and investment and technology scale up that's ever been in existence in the United States. If they can't recognize that, do they really care about this issue? Do they really think that this is some type of handout to the fossil fuel industry? Like everything that we went through, all the billions of dollars, all those projects and stuff, are those all are those all cutouts for the fossil fuel industry? That doesn't make any sense. We don't have time, okay? We don't have time to wait for the perfect bill that Nathan Robinson wants to pass, or skeptics of this bill. Cynics of this bill, I should say. Because I don't think that there would be any bill that could be passed to make people happy. But every single scientist that I know, every single engineer that I know, every single climate scientist that I know is very happy about this bill. It's only these people online that don't dedicate their lives to this issue that are actually faking the most outrage on this. Every single person that's dedicated their life to this issue, they're celebrating this bill. And I'm sick and tired of reading pieces like this that can't recognize any progress that has been made. It's a start. I love that. I love that. Like, we haven't been fucking working on this stuff. How about you cover the technologies and the breakthroughs and the things and the progress that we have made? That's why nobody does. Nobody does, because it's easy. It's easy to be a cynic. It's easy to be a doomer on this issue. It's easy to say that nothing's happening, that Biden hasn't done anything on this issue because it's not all fixed. It's not how it works. It's not how it works. That's not how the world works. We're not going to have a benevolent dictator that comes down and just waves a magic wand and fixes this issue. We have to make progress by moving forward. If you don't want to move forward, then that's fine. But don't say that you care about this issue. Don't belittle the accomplishments of people that have been working on this issue, that dedicated their lives to this issue. It's a fucking joke. If you care about this issue, if you care about climate change, if you care about humans impacting the environment negatively, it is a good time to celebrate. We can celebrate those. We can celebrate the wins. We can look and see that there's a problem that isn't fixed yet, but we have made progress on that. And you know what happens is that when we go to the next election, you say, hey, what are we doing more on this road? Let's go down this road more, rather than starting all anew and saying, oh, I wish we hadn't passed anything. People are so used to taking losses on this, taking loss after loss after loss, that they don't care about making another loss. I do. We don't have time. Humans don't have time in order to wait for a perfect bill to pass the Senate. We have to take action. We have to invest. If you actually care about these issues, if you actually want to know what is going on in science and in technology that is actually going to break through this log jam and actually help solve the problems of the 21st century, That's what this channel is about. I don't think anyone else is actually covering this stuff. I don't think anyone actually cares. I think maybe people do care. I hope you care. But I'm sick of these people. I'm sick of dedicating my life to an issue and having people undermine any type of progress that we've made. It's hard enough. It's hard enough as a scientist that you know that, yeah, you didn't solve the world. You didn't solve the problem. You didn't solve the entire the biggest problem. I mean, global climate change is probably the biggest problem that humans have ever faced in the history of the world. I mean, and you're not going to solve it with one breakthrough, right? But you just know in the back of your head that, hey, maybe we've made progress. Maybe we have. And then you see nobody in the media talking about it. You see maybe a science press article talk about it. Maybe. But nobody actually cares. And then you see all of these people so negative about the climate change, so doomer about this issue constantly. They're so doomer about this. We never make progress. And then a bill passes that is progress. You'd think that they'd want to be happy. You would think that people would want to see some progress being made. But no, they continue down this doomer road. They continue down this stuff. Because it's easy. It's easy to get the clicks. It's easy to get the likes because you can't be doomer enough about this issue. If you're the more and more doomer, that the more and more you know, right? The more and more you know about all the problems. We got to make progress. I'm sick of not making progress. This is a huge progress. This is a huge step forward. If you actually want to follow the breakthroughs in science, the cool stuff that's actually happening, that makes it actually worth being optimistic about in the future, that's what I made this channel for. I'm just a scientist trying to highlight the cool stuff that's happening that nobody talks about. And I'm so sick of it. I'm sick of the doomerism. I'm trying to be optimistic. And I am optimistic. And bills like this make me optimistic about the future. So thanks for watching.